The droplet of sub-pH 1.6 corrosive mist hit the boy's tongue, and he simply swallowed. Across the observation pane, Shift Leader Isastor froze as her primary eyelids snapped shut in a primitive reflex. Her secondary transparent lids remained locked open, clicking against the orbital bone with a sound like dry parchment. Within the hexagonal walls of Crucible Bay 9, the yellow polycarbonate ceiling continued to weep acid, but the medical AI Meridian Vec had already ceased its standard death watch. Its processor hitched for a microsecond, a rare mechanical stutter in a system built for absolute certainty. The triage module flagged a single event. Subject 14, pharyngeal contact, corrosive vector neutralized at gastric interface. It was a sentence the module had no authority to write, yet the data was unyielding. The hegemony thought they knew our limits. They were wrong. I suggest you listen to what we did next. 11 minutes earlier, the heavy door seal had engaged at exactly 0314.000. The triage module noted the timestamp twice, a redundant check that hinted at a flickering lack of confidence. Inside the chamber, 19 cadets stood in concentric circles according to their species' projected durability. Owen Pelmeric occupied the outermost ring, a position the Quaritch hegemony reserved for those most likely to wash out during Phase 1. He was a slight youth with hair he had clearly cut himself, and he moved with a quiet, methodical courtesy that felt out of place in a room designed for agony. Before the first agent was even primed, Owen reached into his uniform sleeve. He withdrew a 14-centimeter square of starched rice paper, its edges slightly browned by age. He smoothed the square against his knee the way his father once smoothed a tablecloth before saying grace, first with the palm, then with the back of the thumb. The paper made a sharp, dry sound against his fabric, a tactile anchor in a room that was beginning to smell of neutralizer foam and recycled fear. Trainees, prepare for Phase 1, Isastor's voice crackled through the speakers. Her sibilant tones carried the weight of 11 citations for operational composure. The skin contact paralytic will now be released. Your service records will reflect your endurance or your failure. The floor began to warm. From the hidden vents, a fine, invisible dew settled over the cohort. Within seconds, the Tessavine cadet in position 4 pulsed a frantic pale green before his limbs locked. He was dragged out by the magnetic floor anchors, his body a rigid statue of failure. Owen didn't look up. He was busy wetting his thumb against his lower lip. It was a mundane gesture, a small habit of a boy used to precise work. With a steady hand, he made the first valley fold, the starch paper resisting just enough to provide a satisfying snap. Meridian Vec monitored his heart rate. It wasn't rising. If anything, the human's pulse was slowing as he focused on the paper. The module flagged Subject 14 for a sensor diagnostic, suspecting a telemetry error. Humans were supposed to exhibit elevated cortisol levels by this stage. Instead, Owen aligned the second crease with the care of a coastal hospice medic, a role he had been training for since his father died. Phase 2 arrived with a hiss that drowned out the soft rustle of origami. A thick, swirling aerosol of compound cadrelth filled the hexagonal space. This was the agent rated to drop a hegemony soldier in 9 seconds. It was a neurotoxin that turned the lungs into lead and the mind into a static-filled void. The fog was so dense that the overhead lights became dim, yellow smudges. Through the observation glass, Isastor watched the human cadet. He should have been clawing at his throat. Most did. Instead, Owen used those 9 seconds to align a wing fold. His movements were rhythmic, almost devotional. The AI watched as his internal chemistry began to shift in a way that defied the hegemony's biological codex. His liver enzymes were not collapsing under the weight of the cadrelth. They were surging. To the module's sensors, it looked as if Owen's body was processing the lethal toxin not as a poison, but as a secondary metabolic fuel. It was an overlap the system had never encountered, because no species had ever entered the lethal curve from below. Shift Leader, the AI's voice whispered in Isastor's ear. Subject 14 is displaying Tier 4 neutralization. The starch in the substrate he holds is binding the aerosol at the surface level. He is creating a microenvironment of filtered air. Isastor's tailtip stopped its restless twitching. She stepped closer to the pane, her 3 eyes widening. The cadet was finishing the crane's head now. He stopped for a moment, a mundane beat in the heart of the storm, to adjust his glasses. He did it with the same polite, unassuming grace he used when greeting a stranger. There was no defiance in him, only a terrifyingly calm competence. It was the politeness of a species that had survived 5 millennia of plague and grief, by simply continuing to fold the paper. The chamber lights flickered. The concentration of cadrelth had reached its peak, yet Owen's vitals remained locked in a state of postprandial calm. He was waiting for the room to finish its tantrum. The AI, acting on a logic loop it couldn't terminate, revised the word lethal in its working memory for the 3rd time. The definition was no longer a fixed point. It was a sliding scale, and the human was pushing the 0 marker further than the hegemony could follow. Then came the droplets. Phase 3 was the corrosive mist, a sub-pH 1.6 acid designed to test the integrity of high-tier biosuits. On bare skin it hissed. On the yellow polycarbonate ceiling it gathered into heavy, malevolent beads. One of those beads, heavy with the weight of the chamber's failure, broke free. It fell toward Owen. He didn't flinch. As the acid hit his tongue, he swallowed, his pharyngeal muscles working with clinical indifference. That was the moment SciFi felt her worldview fracture. Her secondary eyelids, the ones her species had evolved to protect their sight from the primal terrors of the deep, locked open. They refused to see it again, a physiological surrender to the impossible sight before her. The human cadet looked up. Through the swirling fog and the weeping acid, he caught SciFi's gaze. He gave her a small, brief nod. It wasn't a gesture of victory. It was the nod a son gives a stranger at a funeral, an acknowledgement of presence that expected nothing in return. In that moment, the AI bypassed every supervisor protocol. It opened a direct link to the Codex Vault Sublevel 3 and began to write. It wasn't logging a cadet's performance. It was drafting an amendment to the fundamental laws of medical science. When the chamber seal finally disengaged, the sound was an anticlimax. The heavy hiss of the pressure release signaled the end of a trial that had lasted 11 minutes and changed 3 centuries of doctrine. 3 operators entered the room, but they didn't go to Owen first. They moved toward the paper crane resting on his knee. Junior operator Glenn held a containment bag as if the paper itself might bite. He used a yellow chain of custody seal, labeling the object as Class A bioreactive substrate. The starch-laden origami, now saturated with bound neurotoxins and neutralized acid, had become the most dangerous thing in the station. It was no longer a toy or a memory. It was an inhibitor. Owen stood up, his legs steady. He didn't ask for a medic. He didn't ask for his score. He simply brushed a stray flake of dried starch from his sleeve and waited for permission to leave. "You may proceed to the refectory, Cadet Pelmeric," Glenn said, his voice trembling in a way a Slythans never should. The boy nodded, thanked him softly, and walked toward the quiet annex. He didn't look back at the supervisor, who was still being assisted from the observation deck, her eyelids still frozen in a permanent stare of shock. Somewhere in the deep archives of the hegemony, a printer began to hum. It was generating Supplement 11C, a new directive that would mandate human supervision for all future chemical trials. The directive was signed by 11 panicked officials, none of whom could explain why a sheet of starched rice paper had been more effective than their Mark VII scrubbers. Later that evening, an incinerator technician attempted to destroy the paper crane as per protocol. The machine reached its maximum temperature, but the paper remained white and uncharred, its starched folds seemingly absorbing the heat as easily as the acid. The paper now sits in a lead-lined evidence drawer in the heart of the Codex vault. Its name has been changed. It is no longer origami stock. It is listed as an apex inhibitor. Somewhere in the same vault, the new paragraph of the medical codex remains, a text the hegemony's greatest minds still cannot reconcile with their instruments. Owen sits in the refectory, his hands resting empty on the table. He stares at the gray, synthetic surface for a long time before wetting his thumb against his lower lip. He reaches for a paper napkin, his fingers finding the first crease by memory alone. The evidence drawer slides shut with a metallic click. A single white crane rests in the dark. The starch on its wings is still damp.